As mentioned before, the chat box located at the top or bottom of your Zoom window is where we will be posting relevant information and links throughout the program. Please also note that there will be a survey when you exit the program that we encourage you to complete. We value and appreciate your feedback as we learn more about this forum for learning. Finally, let me tell you about our guest today. Kate Thompson is an award-winning journalist, ghostwriter, and novelist who has spent the past 2 decades in the UK mass market and book publishing industry. Kate's newest book, The Stepney Doorstep Society, where you can learn more about the topic of today's discussion, is available on the website of local bookseller Politics and Prose. The link can be found in the chat. You can purchase a copy with a 10% discount by using the code SPECIAL10 at checkout. Kate actually came to us by recommendation of Alan Capps, an adjunct professor of history at George Mason University and Nova, who was interested in her research. Dr. Alan Capps is an adjunct professor of history at George Mason and Northern Virginia Community College. He is currently writing about the visits of Queen Elizabeth II to the United States in 1976 and 2007. Thank you so much to our guests, and thank you to all of you for joining us. And with that, I turn it over to Kate and Alan.
All right, so I'm delighted to be able to talk to Kate Thompson today with her book, The Stepney Doorstep Society.
Nicely positioned there.
One of the reasons that drew me to your book, Kate, is I think a lot of people that have emigrated to the United States obviously trace their roots back to different parts of England, and certainly from my standpoint, on my mother's side, we had a lot of connections with the East End of London, East Ham, West Ham, and Poplar, and I know these are areas that particularly fans of I've forgotten the name of the program.
Call the Midwife.
Call the Midwives. I've seen it on a regular basis now for 9 seasons, and it's become very popular.
Wow,
but the thing that struck me about your book, I mean, particularly focusing on World War II, is that when I was doing some of my own ancestral work, looking at the background of my grandparents and great-grandparents, I actually discovered that my grandmother on my mother's side was killed on the first day of the Blitz in September 1940. And it really, even today in 2020, it shakes you a little bit when you look at the death certificate and you see the reasons why she was killed. And then it lists at the bottom, killed in enemy action in September 1940. So I was immediately drawn to your book and the stories that you set. And again, I think for an American audience, it's very interesting to examine this part of the world prior to Call the Midwife, to understand the society that we're talking about here. So I think to ask you some of these questions, hopefully it'll really open out what the book's about. So my first question to you is, what drew you to focus on these women of the East End of London, and why this particular time frame, the lead up to World War II, and particularly the war years themselves?
Well, I think that's a really good question, Alan, to start. And unlike you, I don't really have any familial links to the East End at all, which always surprises people, because I think they think, well, if you're going to go into the in-depth history of someone, you sort of have a connection with it. But my connection really, I suppose, to chart it back to where it began, is back in 2008, I was working as a ghostwriter. So I was helping other people to write their memoirs, and I was asked by Penguin to ghostwrite the memoirs of a lovely lady called Molly Moran. Now, Molly worked in service, domestic service, between wars as a scullery maid, and the book did phenomenally well, and I think it was all because of the zeitgeist of Downton Abbey. There was this fascination with what occurred below stairs, and Molly gave a very lively retelling of her life as a scullery maid. But what fascinated me was how Molly's life changed when World War II broke out. So as a scullery maid, she was the lowest of the low, really. But what happened when war broke out is she left her life in domestic service and she joined the services. She became a wren. She married an officer. She travelled the world. And so suddenly, war was like a springboard out of drudgery for Molly. And it gave her this vast social mobility that would not have been afforded to her and so many other women in peacetime. So for the first time, she had agency and financial and autonomy and financial independence. And I just thought, wow, I became intrigued, you know, about the social mobility that war gave women that just never would have happened. So with that in mind, my agent said to me, look, why don't you, if you're so fascinated by this, why don't you write a novel set during World War II? And I'd like to say that writing a novel or writing a fiction or non-fiction was a long-held dream of mine, but it really wasn't. I didn't have the confidence to do it. But having written Molly's book and had experience of a long-form narrative, I thought, okay, perhaps I will give this a try. And for me, it was a no-brainer really as to where to set the book. The East End, for me, is a compelling place. It's sort of steeped in mythology and folklore and romanticism, and I think that's fueled by images of foggy lamplit streets and the legend of the Krays and Jack the Ripper, and very much cemented by Call the Midwife, which, interesting, you're right, never really touched on the war years, which I thought was a shame. I thought that'd be fascinating. So anyway, so I knew I wanted to set my book in the East End, but I thought, well, how do I go about feeling my way into an authentic version of the past? Because I was seeking stories, not statistics.
Mm-hmm.
So I got in touch with a philanthropic trust or social welfare housing trust called Peabody Estates, and they have a long history of housing in the East End. And they put me in touch with these two redoubtable women called Vera and Kathy. So off I go to Bethnal Green with my notebook, and Julie sit down and listen to these women who were in their 90s at that point. And they told me in detail about the Blitz, about how the East End almost formed part of their identity. They were fiercely proud to be East Enders. And at the end of the interview, I got up to go, and Vera said to me, oh, wait a minute, love, we knitted you something. And I thought, oh, this is very sweet. I just had my second son at this point, and she pulled out this thing in soft white wool from her knitting bag with a little blue ribbon around the top. I thought, oh, baby booties. Anyway, she held it up, and it was a willy warmer. And they fell about, absolutely howling with laughter at my embarrassment. And I think I tell that story really because what it proves to me is it shatters the preconceptions of elderly women as sort of sweet and doddering. And in fact, Vera and Kathy are very much like how I know most East End women to be, which is irreverent and crafty and subversive and wickedly funny and full of pride and joy. So I went back many times after that and formed a friendship really with these two women. And I did it really because I don't think, you know, that you can encompass somebody's life in 2 hours of an interview. You in order to get the minutiae of life and to really get that incredible lively gush of social history, you go back many times and you learn something different every time. And on one occasion, they took me to Bethnal Green Underground, which we're going to discuss in a later question. But they told me all about the deaths of 173 people on the stairway down to Bethnal Green on March the 3rd, 1943. And this had had a profound effect on these women. They wanted me to know about this hidden disaster. And they gave me an order of service for the memorial that takes place each year to honour the lives of the dead. And on that order of service was a woman called Kate Thompson, so my name. Oh. And it just gave me this, the only way I can describe it is like somebody had reached into my stomach with a fist and pulled it out. I thought, oh, who is this woman? And I just I wanted to know more about this woman, and did we share anything more other than a name? And the story I found out, to my mind, is extraordinary. So I'll tell that story now, if I may. But so Kate was a 63-year-old mum of 9. She was living in a place called Queen Square, Russia Lane. Now, as you will be aware, Alan, Bethnal Green and a lot of areas of the East End pre-war housed some of the absolute worst slums. And of those, Queen Square was definitely the most notorious. It was a place that policemen would only go in pairs. You definitely wouldn't go there after dark. Booth's poverty maps, written in 1897, singled the 6-storey buildings out as very rough, very poor, very noisy. None of the flats had their own water taps or toilets. All the facilities were shared by every family on the landing. Inside fared no better. The walls were damp, riddled with bed bugs and lice. The ceiling was coming down in blocks of plaster. The wash house facilities were located on the roof, so if you wanted to take your washing, you had to drag it up 6 flights of stairs. And according to one local resident, the stench from Russia Lane was unholy. And they had its own, I've never heard of this phrase before, but it was called a personal cleansing station. And according to records held at Tower Hamlets, 3,831 children attended for infestations of vermin, and a further 1,287 treated for scabies, or as it was otherwise referred to, the itch. So when cursory research didn't bode well, I began to think this is quite a depressing tale. And by August 38, Kate lived in a really squalid, dilapidated hellhole. The conditions had deteriorated drastically. There were broken steps, there was no lock on the lavatory, the wash house facilities were broken. But not only that, the landlords were having a very merry, the rapacious landlords, that is to say, were having a merry time at their expense. They charging exorbitant rents, really, for such miserly facilities. But here, to me, is where the story takes a twist. So according to the Electoral Register, Kate was registered to vote from 1923, which I felt surprising because women had only been given the vote 5 years previous to that. And I think it was this interest perhaps in politics or a decent standard of living which led to her basically forming a tenants association. And in cahoots with what was then known as the Stepney Tenants Defence League, which was actually a communist-based organisation, Russia Lane decided to hold a rent strike. Now, this was the biggest rent strike that had ever been seen in East End, and it absolutely sent the press wild. And I think buoyed by their success, the tenants made these placards saying less rent, more repairs, and they paraded around Bethnal Green and they picketed the landlord's estate office. They contacted their MP. You know, East End women have always been very good at using their voices, and they certainly did in this instance. They made an absolute noise and drew attention to their cause, really. Now, apparently every time the landlord went into the square, on one occasion he was accompanied by Oswald Mosley's fascist black shirts, who, again, we're going to talk about Oswald Mosley in a further question, but basically attempting to use organised hooliganism. They were trying to break up the rent strike, and it was very much a siege condition. The women, being women and quite organised at that time, had drawn up a rota. So you had some women on the barricades, which literally had barbed wire and planks of wood to stop the landlord getting in. Then you had other women taking their turn looking after the children and doing the shopping. So on this occasion, the landlord came in. He was met by an absolute ruckus. These women pelted in with rotten flour, mouldy potatoes, veg. The children of the square gathered around him, booing and hissing. The women were seeing him off with their placards. And he really ran with his tail between his legs. And after 2 weeks, he ceded to their demands. He backed down. He agreed to lower the rents and make the necessary repairs. I suspect perhaps shamed by the amount of publicity that this rent strike got. And it was absolutely a resounding success. And I think that just using this iron will and this instinctive understanding of the power of solidarity, these women found that they did have a voice and they were able to effect great change within their community. And a year later, war broke out, so 1939, and Kate faced the second biggest battle of her life. And I think during this cataclysmic period, she was reported to have put out incendiary bombs on the roof of her building. She nursed her neighbour's son through double pneumonia. She was, in short, a magnificent woman, you know, about as far removed from any of the things I think I could have personally done as is possible. But what struck me was Kate's death, age 63, on a sort of squalid, damp stairwell in an entirely preventable accident was devastating to me, because I just thought, well, here's a woman who had the spirit to fight for the repressed and to take on bullies, to die in a preventable accident, and then be ignored by history books. You know, she's not even a footnote in the history books. She's a forgotten woman in a forgotten tenement. And I felt very passionately at that point, right, I need to give a voice to these women. I want to amplify her voice, and I want to find out more about the richness and complexity of East End matriarchy, because if she's this fabulous and amazing, this one woman, what are the rest of the women from the East End like?
Right.
And so Molly and Vera and Kathy and Kate were the catalyst, really, for me wanting to explore East End social history and those surprising little stories that history often holds.
Right. Well, again, you know, it's interesting when you look back at this, the era that you're talking about and the people you talk to, in essence, is less than 100 years ago. And in fact, in some of the episodes of Call the Midwife, I think American audiences get a flavor of the dilapidation and the sheer state of run-down buildings that are beginning to be replaced. But, you know, some of the ideas you put forward or pick profiles of people dragging stuff up serious flights of stairs and no clean running water. I mean, that starts to come through, and that is the late 1950s. So
yes.
One can only imagine
what it was like in the 40s. Yeah. And it's an interesting point, that because many women I do interview and I say, how does it compare to Call the Midwife? And they say, well, yeah, there's a lot of similarities, but it's way too clean. Yeah. You know, a lot of these women, they grew up in squalor, you know, it's no surprise that there's certain areas like Stratford that were known as Stinky Stratford. It was very much the noxious heartland. And talking of the poverty of those times, I came across this statistic which really struck me, that by 1931 a census recorded that 18,000 dwellings were housing 27,000 people in Bethnal Green. So unemployment, low wages, overcrowding were very much the characteristics of Bethnal Green and the East End as a whole, that were really sitting in the backyard of the richest square mile in England.
Right.
So you have the East End butting up against the City of London and its great wealth and power, and none of that ever filtered back to the East End. And I really like this quote that I found in a survey held at the archives in Tower Hamlets, and it said, "There is a paradox that in a borough noted as a centre of the boot, shoe and clothing trade, only a reported 5% of children are well clothed and shod." And that's very much true to the memories that I heard of, you know, if you were rich, you had a pair of shoes that didn't have a hole in it.
Well, and I think the other thing that we will explore as we move through this is, again, the geographical location of the docks of London to the east of London is going to be pivotal in why they became such a target during the Blitz. But we'll come on to that. So if I asked you, and I know it's a different question, to pick 3 individuals and 3 events that really stood out from your research in writing the book, who would you pick? What would they be and why?
You really tested me with this one, Alan, because I think all the women in the book are amazing, but I tried to pick 3 that I think reflect the tones and the themes that I wanted to emerge. And the first one was about a wonderful lady I met called Betty. And I met Betty in a community group in Poplar. She was in her late 90s, I think, at this point. And you know how, like, in the opening credits of Call the Midwife, you see a street of children playing cricket and there's a vast container ship going sliding past the end of the road. And that was very much Betty's street. You know, she lived her father worked in the docks. They were rooted in the economy of the docks. Her backyard basically faced onto the docks, and so she would often see these container ships going past. Now, one day Betty was out playing in the backyard, and it was a typical backyard, tin bathtub on the wall, and you had the outdoor toilet and a few chickens scratching about, when all of a sudden an enormous pink pig came flying over the back wall and landed with this sort of fleshy thud on the roof of the outdoor toilet. Now, Betty looked up, she was only 8 or something at the time, and she called out, "Mum, there's a pig just flown over the back wall." And of course her mum, who's knee deep in washing or domestic work, called out from the scullery, "You wait till your father gets home." But sure enough, she came out, and indeed there was a giant pig sitting on the back, on the toilet roof. Now, this pig had been stuffed and gutted and stuffed with all manner of goodies, from sort of tins of peaches to chocolate, nylons, you know, unimaginable luxuries, really. And what had happened was Betty's father, who worked as a stevedore down the docks, unloading and loading goods from the big container ships, had befriended a Southeast Asian Lascar sailor. And he'd brought him home the previous evening and he'd shown him a bit of good old East End hospitality. And to repay him, the next day at work, the sailor had liberated the pig and its contents from the ship that he was unloading, which was not uncommon at all. You know, pilfering from the docks was almost accepted practice back then. But what I love about this story most is Betty's father's reaction. He came home, he butchered the pig, and he shared the spoils with the whole street. And it was a long terrace street. Everybody got a share. Be it, you know, a couple of rashers of bacon or a tin of peaches, whatever. And there are 3 things that I hear time and again from East End women, whether they're from Hoxton or Hackney, but it's this, that what little we had, we shared. We lived collectively, not individually, and neighbours were as close as family. And I think that the Flying Pig story for me really embodies that sentiment and really illustrates how close neighbourhoods really, really were back then. And I think it also gives a human face to the very sort of diverse multiculturalism of the East End. You know, prior to the war, I think, we've discussed this before, but I think that there was this belief that England was a very white place, and that not until 1948 and the arrival of HMS Windrush did people see black people in the streets. That might have been true in the more rural communities, but certainly in dockyard communities like in the East End and Liverpool. You know, Betty would have walked down the street and as a young child, and she'd have seen Chinamen with sort of pigtails and ice blue eyes, and she'd have seen Indian toffee men and Southeast Asian Lascar sailors and black, you know, West Indian sailors. And in fact, Canning Town, so many West Indian sailors married white women, that the area actually became known as Draft Board Alley. So for me, it smashes the myth really of that we only see white faces prior to sort of the 50s. It definitely was not the case. It was a very diverse, vibrant area, the dockyard communities. So that's Betty.
Okay, that's one.
That's one. My second story is a little darker than that, and it concerns a lady I met. I was doing a library talk in Bethnal Green, and I told the audience I was planning a book on writing about the matriarchy. And she instinctively said to me, "You want to come and interview me about my mum?" And like how it is with some people, you can just meet them, and I just knew that this twinkly-eyed woman had a story to tell.
Right.
And so I met Trish outside of the Underground in East End, and she wanted to show me around her community. She wanted me to understand the role that her mum played in the community. And she described her mum, who was a mother of 7 girls, as very much the street matriarch. And she said every turning had one. She was the go-to woman when something needed sorting. If a woman fell behind on her rent, Mum would step in and negotiate with the rent collector to stop her being evicted. Dodgy-looking men, Mum would see them off. If there was any trouble, Mum sorted it. Baby needed delivering, Mum was the one the local girls turned to. She even apparently got involved when her husband's neighbour was demanding too much sex. She was basically, as Trish described her, she was midwife, nurse, social worker, citizen advice bureau worker, all rolled up in one apron. But I actually had to conceal Trish and her mother's real identity due to the inflammatory nature of her activities, because her mother, who I actually called Polly in the book, had a dual identity. Polly was a childminder by day, but she was an abortionist by night. And I was quite taken aback when Trish first told me this. I think there's very much a perception due to popular culture that abortionists in working class communities are nearly always shadowy evil figures who live down back streets and have names like Hat Pin Bella. But that absolutely wasn't the case in her mother's situation. And over time, Trish gained an understanding of the way that her mother worked. And some of these details are unsavoury, but I felt it important to include within the book. So her chosen method was a crochet hook. She used to use the kitchen table. She laid down a rubber sheet. And if the pregnancy had been advanced enough and the fetus was intact, she would give the fetus a burial in the churchyard opposite their house. Now, their house was, I don't know if you've seen EastEnders, but it was a square, terraced houses running all the way around. It was very much like that sort of setup. And she told her daughter with a brutal logic that she wanted to bury the fetuses in consecrated ground to give them a dignified send-off. And I think as her mother's secret unfurled, Trish really looked at her mother with new eyes, just marvelling at that dichotomy between here is a woman who looks after children by day and is very capable of nurturing life, a religious woman who attends church, but by night has this hidden identity almost. So I started delving a little bit more into this, and obviously I knew that abortion was illegal and that birth control was virtually non-existent really for married women. But certainly out-of-war wedlock sex definitely added to these numbers. I think the arrival of 2 million American GIs to Britain in 1942, I think that's about right with the figures. And the number of illegitimate births in England and Wales jumped from 24,000 in 1939 to 35,000 in 1942. And so in response, we got this clandestine, almost subculture of working class women like Trish's mum who stepped in. And I think for Trish's mum, certainly, it was a case of understanding that for many women would come to and say, I don't want to go into double digits. They didn't want more than 10 children. They couldn't afford another mouth to feed. So it wasn't a case of sort of a glamorous fling. You know, for these women, she provided an essential service. And I was a little worried about including this chapter because I thought, am I, sensationalising something I shouldn't? So I went to the Abortion Law Reform Association and they read through the chapter and they came back and said, absolutely, this is a woman very much ties in with our understanding of female abortionists. They were women well known within their area. They weren't shadowy figures like Hat and Bella. They were well known to their communities and they performed a function in society, if you like. And they were always prompted, or not always, but mostly prompted by a sense of female solidarity, and they never took payment for it. So Trish told me that she tended to know when her mum had helped a woman because the next day there'd be a bag of shopping or a packet of fags on the doorstep.
Right.
I guess I just found this whole situation quite mind-blowing. It really showed to me the complexity and the nuance of and the possible choices that faced women in the late 20th century as regards to, you know, they had no autonomy or control over their bodies, no birth control. So women like Trish's mum provided options, I think we could say. So she was a fascinating woman to me. My third story is a lovely lady called Beatty Orwell, who is now just celebrated her 103rd birthday.
Wow.
She's just come out of the London hospital in Whitechapel. She had a hip replacement. This woman is Teflon coated. She survived most things, I think. But Beatty Orwell really grew up watching the Stepney Doorstep Society caring for its own. So when she was 13, her father died of a stroke, and he left her mother to care for 3 children. Now, the community where Beatty was born, which was in Whitechapel, very much the Jewish quarter of the East End, absolutely rallied around them. There was no way that Beatty's children were going to be seen queuing at the soup kitchen. That was never going to happen. So she really saw that society caring for its own. And I think that sense of duty to the community really embedded itself within Beatty, because when that same community came under threat in the 1930s from the rise of fascism, and Sir Oswald Mosley and his British Union of Fascist Black Shirts, who used to march through the area, her reaction was instinctive. She joined the anti-fascist party. She said, age 19, she said, I couldn't dance, so I might as well get involved in that. And that's what she did. And Beatty was one of 250,000 people who stood up to the fascists at what is now known the Battle of Cable Street. And I'm sure you're well aware, Alan, of this battle. Do you feel this is something that people will know about, the Battle of Cable Street?
My guess is not a great many people will know. I think there's a greater understanding now of Mosley and his fascists, but this particular incident, I don't think a lot of Americans will probably know a great deal about. So why don't you explain a little more?
Yeah, I will do. So in the 1930s, Sir Oswald Mosley formed the British Union of Fascists with funding from Mussolini, and he very much saw himself in the same guise as Adolf Hitler and Mussolini. And anti-Semitism, back then in the 1930s, fascists were given a very public platform on which to preach. Anti-Semitism was rife, and it was people by and large turned a blind eye. So a young Jewish woman like Beatty walking through the East End, there were certain areas of the East End that were no-go land. So from Whitechapel, you wouldn't go into Bethnal Green because that was an area where the fascists were. But Beatty, being quite independent of spirit, did, and she would often go, and she'd see these enormous fascist rallies. They were on every street corner, soapbox orators, and often these rallies broke out into explosive violence. I've seen her tell of weapons like razor blades, hidden potatoes, chair legs. Fierce fighting would break out, and Beatty on many occasions was chased through the streets by fascist black shirts, told to go home geared, beaten with sort of the end of a belt buckle. But this didn't deter her. She felt very strongly that she had to give a voice to anti-fascism. So on the 4th of October 1936, Oswald Mosley had planned a huge march to celebrate the 4th birthday of the movement. And what he planned was 4 big marching columns to go through the heartland of the East End, culminating in 4 big rallies at which he was going to speak at. And it was to be the triumphant sort of prelude to his wedding to one of the Mitford sisters. He was travelling to Germany the next day to get married with Adolf Hitler as one of his guests. So the day arrived, which was a Sunday, and the black shirts assembled at Royal Mint Street, which is near the Tower of London. Astonishingly, they had a mounted horseback guard of 7,000 Metropolitan Police to ensure the passage through the East End, which tells you something, doesn't it? But so basically, it wasn't just designed to be an inflammatory march. It was really there to deliver a hammer blow to the Jewish community in the East End. But on the day, things didn't go according to plan. So what happened, an estimated crowd, there was no definite numbers, but of 250,000 culminated at a place called Gardener's Corner, which is really the complex of all the major thoroughfares through the East End. And there was no unifying factor to this crowd on the day, no overriding political belief other than a reaction to fascism. They all stood for anti-fascism. So you had young and old, you had children, you had trade unionists, you had women, you had the Irish who all came up from the docks to help and lend their voice and their support, elderly Orthodox Jews, men who fought in the Boer Wars. So it was an incredibly vibrant and diverse crowd. And they stood there on the barricades, and somebody actually drove a tram through and stopped it and left it there. But it was impossible for them to get through. And there was fierce fighting between, interestingly enough, not the black shirts and the anti-fascists, but the police and the anti-fascists. There were a lot of arrests. They were indiscriminate with their truncheons, a lot of injuries. And the fascists were forced to divert down Cable Street. There's a very long, narrow street that used to be a rope walk that connects the city of London to the docks. Now, they'd already erected barricades all along Cable Street, and the scenes must have been astonishing. There were women leaning out of their upstairs windows, throwing out their slops over the heads of police, and then there were children rolling marbles under the feet of the police's horse hooves, the hooves of the police horses. And this fighting went on for hours until eventually the Commissioner of Metropolitan Police, Philip Gane, ordered that the march be suspended. And Oswald Mosley had no choice but to divert and to march back through the deserted embankment. And very much the streets of the sort of the ancient East End were barred to him that day. And it was a deciding moment in the sort of resistance against fascism and racism in the East End. It's very much part of East End folklore now. It's something that people from the area are hugely proud to be involved in. And I think 1936, the year of the Battle of Cable Street, was a very restless, uncertain one. I think because of the abdication crisis, there were three kings on the throne. We had hunger marches in the street. We had the Spanish Civil War had broken out. And I get the impression from Beattie that she very much cut her teeth on those times, if you like. It formed who she became. And when war broke out, Beattie, she was bombed out of her flat in Whitechapel. She worked as a postwoman. She made munitions in a factory. And after the war, she campaigned very hard to get the Labour Party into power. You know, she really didn't want to ever see a return to the conditions that they had suffered. And I've remained friends with Beattie ever since. And it really made me laugh, actually, the way I met her. I knew I wanted to feature the Battle of Cable Street in my third novel. And I consulted a historian who shall remain nameless, and he said to me, "Oh, you won't find any women who fought at the Battle of Cable Street, and if you do, they'll all be dead." Right. So I put something on an East End Facebook site, and within moments, this woman, Maureen, had popped up. She said, "Oh, my mum was at the Battle of Cable Street. You want to come and interview her?" So I did. I went along to the Stepney Jewish Community Centre. And honestly, Alan, it was like stepping into a time portal. I felt like I'd sort of stumbled upon this tribe who had the key to long life, because all the women there were in their late 90s, all bustling around, and they were incredibly garrulous and vivacious. In fact, when I first met them, there was a dartboard, and they'd been playing darts when I turned up. There was a dartboard there, and on the centre of the dartboard was a picture of Justin Bieber. And they'd obviously been having fun firing darts at Justin Bieber's face. And she said, "What, you think we sit around playing whist all day?" Anyway, they sat down and they told me in detail. So Beattie was there with all her friends, and many of whom had also been at the Battle of Cable Street. And history just burst into life for me, because they told me about the roar of the crowds at Battle of Cable Street and the cries of "No Pasarán," which I think was in solidarity with the Spanish Civil War. "They shall not pass." Right. And all the tiny detail. And it really, like I say, I came away from the interview on a high, because that was how history became real to me, and I was able to write about it with much more authenticity. But I think the message I take from Beattie really is that I think a lot of people have the preconception that East End women are mired in domesticity. Not true. A lot of East End women back there, as we know from Kate and we now know from Beattie, were politically active and politically engaged, because politics wasn't, in Westminster, politics was in their street. It was about the fight for housing and for improvements in their life and for their safety. So she really taught me that, I think, that whenever you write about the East End, don't just make it about the domestic life. These politically motivated women who have a culture of curiosity. And, Beattie really took on her enemies, I think, with great courage and imagination. So I'm very much in awe of Beattie Orwell. And I wonder, might I be permitted to add one more story to those three? If I might. Thank you. I include this story because I love it. I think everybody has this image definitely fueled by Henry Moore, who was a prolific wartime artist, that life underground during the Blitz, when people were sheltering, was raw and elemental, and it was just a case of people, a desperate fight for survival, and people were sleeping on underground platforms, nose to tail, as it were. And that's definitely true, but actually not the case at Bethnal Green Underground. There's a very different story, and quite a surprising story that emerges from there. So when the Blitz broke out and people were beginning to, these beginnings of stirrings of revolt, and people were taking over the tubes, this is what happened with Bethnal Green. Somebody acquired the key and they took it over, and people stormed down. And to begin with, it very much tallied with that image of Blitz sheltering. People were sleeping on cold concrete platforms, and they were doing their business in a bucket, and it was, the fight for survival. But actually, over time, it transformed itself within the space of a year into something completely different. And so what actually happened, the council went down and they installed a sort of ventilation system and whitewashed the walls, and there were chemical toilets installed. And the Boy Scouts actually went down and erected triple bunks for 7,000 people to sleep down the eastbound tunnels. And this is where, to me, it got fascinating, because actually what it did over the course of a year was transform itself into a self-governing, fully functioning subterranean town, really. So they took all the conveniences they'd had above ground and sunk them below ground. So you had a cafe that was staffed by this incredibly smiley lady called Alice, who used to serve up bacon butties. You had a shelter theatre where you had shows and Russian baritone singers, and Sadler's Wells even put on a ballet at the Underground Theatre there.
Wow.
And a library that was taken. So when the Central Library was bombed overhead, the librarians basically took all 4,000 volumes of books, took it underground. They built, with a grant of £50, they built a temporary shelter over the platform, the tracks of the westbound tunnel. And you had a librarian there with 4,000 volumes. It was a fully functioning little librarian. You had a doctor's quarters. You had a creche that women could leave their children at and go to work. And so you see this, there was art and there was culture and there was life down there. And many childhoods really rolled out down there. I remember speaking to a lovely lady called Pat Spicer, and she remembers playing Kiss Chase down the tunnel. She lived underground for 4 years. She would come up in the morning and go to school and then to work when she began work. But her life was the underground life. And so she would go along to the library and take out Millie Molly Mandy, and then she'd do tap dancing at the Shelter Theatre. And another lovely lady I spoke to called Minxie, who was famous, her and her 3 sisters, the Agambar sisters, famous for their beauty. And they used to sing harmonies in the Shelter Theatre to keep everybody bonded and entertained. And so all life rolled out there. There was Christmas trees at Christmas and Salvation Army choirs. There was weddings, bar mitzvahs. Life happened around. And I think, to me, it's surprising, and it offers up a really valuable picture of how a community reacts when it's put under the ultimate test. I think the government feared that there would be this, that they would develop what they called a troglodyte mentality, that they would go to the ground and they would turn lawless and fearful, and God forbid they would never emerge above ground again. But in reality, that just didn't happen. This community became a fully functioning, thriving, self-governing community with many, many characters and life that burst out of the tunnels.
And what I think is interesting about that also, again, for an American audience, is that obviously the power gets turned off when the underground closes at night, and then turned back on again in the morning. And the underground literally functions during the day. The people vacate, underground functions, people come back, power turned off. And as you say, this goes on night after night after night.
Yeah.
Amazing.
And it is amazing. And I think in other tube stations, and I spoke to this one woman called Gladys who said to me, I tried sleeping on every single tube station on the Central Line. She said, Bethnal Green was my favourite for obvious reasons. But she said, I tried almost like they were little hotels or something. She would try each train station out to see how she liked it. And I just find it astonishing that you could be lying. So I think, obviously not the case in Bethnal Green because it wasn't a working station. They hadn't, at the outbreak of war, they were working on connecting it to Liverpool Street on the Central Line. So when war broke out, building work was suspended, and so it was a vacant station, and the tunnels were sealed off, I think something like a mile up the tracks. Mm-hmm. But certainly in the case of working train stations, there was a yellow line system. I think that if you were a shelterer, you had to stay behind the second yellow line and put your bundle of bedding down for the night there. So you could queue up and you could enter the station while there were still commuters and travellers. You weren't allowed to cross the yellow line. And then once the tube station closed and the train stopped running, then you could spread out a little bit more. But people still recall, you know, the stragglers still recall waking up in the morning and seeing the first tube stations coming in, and commuters and, you know, men in bowler hats and pinstripe suits getting off and walking off while they're packing up their bedding.
Right.
A very peculiar, strange life. But that was what people had to do to survive, to function.
Yeah, exactly.
But I just love that story of Bethel Green, because I often think what a wonderful film that would be, or a TV drama to set underground, you know, underground life and all the complexities and joys and the art and the culture and the life that must have flowed through those tunnels.
Yeah, it's amazing. Truly amazing. Excellent.
Thank you.
All right. So that
Sorry.
No, so it brings up an interesting point. How did these women react to you as essentially an outsider coming into this community and writing about them and their lives and their world? I mean, how did they react to that? And what has been the reaction since with the publication of your book?
Yeah, really good question. And I think for many people, well, who are you? Why do you have the right to write about me? My personal feeling on it is I go in and I try to hold up a mirror to the times. So the reaction very much from the women has been one of relief. And I say because last year marked the, last year marked the 80th anniversary of the outbreak of World War II. And of course, we saw the predictable tranche of books celebrating Churchill. You know, I was in Boyle's bookshop and there were 3 biographies to Churchill alone. You know, we see all the books and the TV programmes celebrating the role of the services, the WI, the WVS. But nowhere do we hear about women like Beattie and Kate, you know, the sort of, as I call them, the women missing from the history books. I think the reason for that is because they don't wear a uniform. They have never worn a uniform. There's no archive, there's no institute of matriarchs that you can, you know, they don't leave a paper trail. And so very much I found women like Beattie and Kate by going to community groups, bingo mornings, coffee mornings, tea dances, you know, anywhere I can to get that unfiltered gush of history. And so I think I say relief, and I think people feel, they very much felt relieved to have been heard and to have their voices, you know, amplified, and their contribution to the economic, the social, the political history of East London. And I've taken these women everywhere. They've been on the BBC, they've been on radio and TV, they've been in the national press, and they have loved it. They have milked their moment and really enjoyed it. And for me, it's been a wonderful thing to watch, actually. But there was one slight interesting moment I felt at the book launch. One of the ladies, Mari, who was buried alive in an Anderson shelter during the Blitz. 3 nights she was trapped below ground, and she told this harrowing story to the audience. And at the end of it, her daughter got up and she said, "Mum, why did you never tell me that story?" And she replied, "Because you never asked."
Right.
And I think it leads to another interesting point that I feel like I've stumbled upon in researching this book, is one of the issue of aging. I think, I don't know what you would say it's like in America, but certainly here, we are an ageist society and we worship at the temple of youth. And so often we overlook stories of particularly working class women. And, you know, many of these women say to me, you know, they complain of paling into invisibility as they age, as if they're sort of a pencil drawing that's being slowly rubbed out. And I hate that. You know, I feel like this generation and that wartime generation, their stories are the lifeblood of our country, and we should be listening more. And it was perfectly illustrated to me. I was interviewing 2 women called Eileen and Anne in a supermarket cafe. And at the end of the interview, this man walked past me, bashed the back of her chair, and he didn't even look back. And I sort of looked at her like that, and Eileen said to me, "Kate, what you have to understand is when you're 80, you're invisible. When you're 90, you might as well be dead." She said, "I might have snow on the roof, but I'm not old. I've got stories to tell." And she has very much, and I'll never stop listening to those stories. So I think to conclude with that question is that very much, you know, I feel like that people understand as well that this is the last opportunity to document and to listen to those lively reminiscings, because in 5 years' time that opportunity won't exist. It will have passed into the muddy soup of history, and we'll have to read it in books and look at it in archives. So I think they felt like, yes, I've been heard now. And that's important.
Of all the women you talk to and the stories, what surprised you the most about the women of the East End? Is there one thing that really stands out to you?
Yeah, definitely. I think, and that would be the nature of matriarchy in the East End. I imagined the East End to be a patriarchal place. I thought men ruled, and to some degree they did, particularly in the pubs and the docks and the factories. But in the street and the home and the doorstep, it was women who reigned supreme. And I couldn't get my head around, to begin with, the fact that every street or turning, as it was more commonly known, had its own chief female, or as they were more commonly known, the auntie. And, you know, I just became intrigued by the power and the influence that these women wielded from their doorsteps, you know. And I think that what I began to understand was that, you know, in the first half of the 20th century, before the advent of the welfare state and the institutionalization of roles, these women played those roles. So, you know, they played an extraordinary plethora of roles, from laying out the bodies of the dead to birthing new life. They lent money, they sorted out errant husbands, you know, they kept roofs overhead. They were the go-to integral women. And in the absence of things like citizen advice and social workers and vets and doctors and midwives and nurses, who back then women had to pay for, these women were that. They were the welfare state. And that's what, as I began going on with these interviews, and every woman I went to interview, I'd say, oh, who was your auntie? And straight away they knew what I meant by that. And they said, oh, it was Polly, or it was Mrs. Dudgeon. You know, but so they really understood that. And that was a big surprise to me, to understand this sort of, you know, network or army of chief females who kept us running. And that's what really became the book. Initially, it was going to just be about, you know, celebrating the role of women in the 80th anniversary of the outbreak of war. And then it became much more about this network of women, this sort of chief females who ruled the cobbles, really.
Right.
And the other thing, just to conclude that question, is, you know, what surprised me. I think for me, it's about the very ribald, naughty sense of humour a lot of these women have. You know, we saw the Willy Warmer, and I met this other woman, and we did an interview, and she was immaculately turned out, as Eastern women always are. It's a real badge of honour to look your best, and everything matched, from the accessories and the hat and the gloves. And I said, oh, you look like you're off for tea with the Queen. I said, where are you off to? And she said, oh, I'm only going down the doctor's. And she goes, I'm getting a flu jab. And I said, oh, that's no good. She went, oh, I don't know, love. It's the only prick I'll get all day. And to hear that out of the mouth of a 90-year-old woman is shocking. But they've retained that spirit and that irreverence. That was a big shock to me.
Well, and obviously probably the biggest issue, in a sense, that they had to deal with, that you cover extensively, is the impact of the Blitz. You know, a sustained German bombing campaign that goes on for over 290 days, beginning in late summer 1940 through the late spring of 1941. Tell us a little bit about your research and your interviews about how the women of the East End, both individually and collectively, dealt with this challenge of this sustained bombing campaign on East London.
Well, I think we're talking at an auspicious time, aren't we? Because this marks 80 years, doesn't it? And
indeed,
there are certain things that are written down in stone that are fact. I think more or less we know that 43,000 people were killed over the course of that time period. That 1 million houses in London alone were destroyed. I think something like 18,000 tons of explosives were dropped. So those are the sort of indisputable facts. What is more shrouded in mystery, I think, is this so-called myth of the Blitz, which we hear time and again people referring to. And I think if you believe that, everybody was sort of digging out bodies from bomb sites before cheerfully whistling their way to work. In reality, where you have humanity, there's always going to be polarities of experience within that. And so it is the case, very much so in the East End. And I think for all the women that I've interviewed, and I would probably estimate now coming up to about 150 East End women, the Blitz was the most significant part of those memories. And for everyone that said, who took on the Blitz with great courage and bravery, there are just as many women who admitted being absolutely terrified.
Right.
And one woman I met called Emily, who sadly she's died now, but I interviewed her when she was in her 90s. And her parents refused to go to a shelter, as is common with a lot of people. You know, philosophy, well, if I'm going to get it, I'll get it in my own bed, what will be,
Right.
So they used to hide under the kitchen table, and she recalls every night the sound of the drone, the throbbing drone of the bombers coming overhead as sounding like they were saying, for you, for you, for you. And she goes, I could still have a panic attack if I stopped to think about it now. So people were, obviously terrified, but the one unifying factor I felt that seemed to embody most experiences was one of anger. I think this very raw and visceral and unadulterated anger swept over certainly the East End. And that's got to be fueled by exhaustion. I think the average amount of sleep that people were getting was 4 to 5 hours a night. Mm-hmm. So you can imagine that over a sustained period of time. And not only that, you're out in the morning, you're clearing up the rubble, you're seeing if your house is still standing, you're trying to find a tap to boil water for a cup of tea, you're stretching rations to many mouths. So that nervous exhaustion kicked in, and this raw anger sort of overtook women. And it was very much illustrated by this story that was told to me by a lady called Gladys, who I met. Now, Gladys was about 8 years old, and actually was bombed out of her house on the first night of the Blitz. And after that was relocated, but very much had to hide under her mother's bed. They weren't going to go to a shelter. Mm. So on about the six months into the Blitz, Gladys was standing with her mum and a group of the local women, and there was a raid in progress, and they were standing out on their balconies watching this raid. And suddenly this shriek tore over the buildings, and somebody said, "There's a Jerry coming down." And sure enough, a German pilot who had only moments before been bombing the area had bailed out, and he was drifting down through the skies on his parachute. And Gladys just basically watched as before her very eyes a lynch mob formed. Now, individually, these women were tough. Mm. Collectively, they must have been terrifying. And they made a grab for whatever they could find, coal shovels, brooms, you name it, anything that they could use as a weapon, they grabbed. And they went after this German pilot. Now, when he had come down in a nearby street, his parachute had tangled around a gas lamp. He couldn't get away. And Gladys watched in astonishment as the first woman ran up to him and she said, "That's for my son at Dunkirk," took the coal shovel and smacked this guy round the face with it. Right. From that moment on, you can imagine it must have been terrifying for this German pilot. And in the end, a group from a home guard broke through these women with fixed bayonets, and they rescued the pilot. They put him in the back of an ambulance and took him to a hospital, but he later died of his injuries. It's not known whether he died from the injuries of coming down or whether the beating from these women. Right. But he's buried here in a military cemetery called Brookwood, which is not too far from where I live. But I find that story fascinating because it really paints a picture of what happens when women are shocked out of their normal rhythm and routine, and anger reaches a boiling point and it has to spill over. And I think, we might not agree with the lynching of a German pilot, but it takes the true temperature of the times. So that's why I wanted to tell that story, to show that exhaustion and anger. And there's another story that was told to me by a lovely lady called Sue, who found her mum's written memoirs after she died. And I'm going to tell this story because I feel it shows the sheer randomness of a Blitz death, the truly bizarre and shocking ways that you could die. So this is what her mum wrote. She said, "I was 23 and a new wife and mother. I was pushing my baby along Oxford Street in her pram when the alarm sounded. That was a sound that made your blood run cold. I stopped and there was a man walking towards me. I didn't know him, but everyone showed concern for everyone else in those days. He looked at me with my pram and he shouted, 'Run, get your kiddie safe, I'm right behind.' He didn't finish the sentence because at that moment a bomb dropped and the blast sent terrible shockwaves right across where we were standing. I heard a bang, a whoosh and a whistling sound, and I instinctively ducked as the plate glass window was blown out of the shop opposite me. It missed me, went over the top of my pram and sliced the man horizontally in two. I watched in horror as his head rolled up the street." And I think, what a thing to find in your mother's diary about her experiences of Blitz. And I think it shows the spectre of loss under which people lived. But Alan, I'm really keen to understand your ancestor, the Blitz story that you were saying about your grandmother, was it, who died on the first night of the Blitz?
Well, it's interesting because actually it was my great-grandmother, and they went to the Anderson shelter. And just to explain what Anderson shelters were to people who are listening, these are shelters that were issued by the government in the late part of 1938 and 39 in preparation for what everyone assumed was going to be this mass German onslaught, the H.G. Wells idea of the city being laid waste. And obviously we had seen some evidence of what the Germans did in Guernica during the Spanish Civil War. And these Anderson shelters were simply corrugated iron, bent over, buried into the soil, and soil put on top. And they were designed to provide some type of protection, as you know. Well, they went to the shelter on the first night of the raid, and a bomb actually came down within like 10 yards of where the shelter was and literally blew them out of the shelter. And it's funny because my great aunt, until she died in the late 1980s, still bore the scars on her face. She had shrapnel still embedded in her face. And I remember as a kid asking my mum, what are those marks on Aunt Gladys's face? And my mum told me they were still the shrapnel marks. But I don't think a lot of people can really appreciate what these people went through night after night. But that actually brings me to another point that you bring up as well, is even though the East End was going through it, and obviously all parts of London being hit, but as we said, the East End of London, because of the docks, were being truly hammered. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about what you found out about the difference between how East Enders viewed what the West End of London was going through.
Yeah, there was a huge disparity between experience, I think. If you lived in Bethnal Green and you were lucky enough to have a backyard in which to put an Anderson shelter, you had shelter.
Right.
Something like 5 miles between Bethnal Green and the West End. It was a very different story in the West End. I think if you were rich, you had a steel line dugout, you had evacuated your children possibly to the country or even America, and you were living in fine style. You were going to the Savoy, you had an underground banqueting suite there where a waiter would bring you a hot water bottle and a brandy and tuck you in for the night. Bomb waiters, I think they were called, blitz waiters.
Right.
It was a very different experience for those people who were living in the West End or in the wealthier areas to those living in the East End. And understandably, there was anger about that because I think many people felt like they'd been left out to dry. Hung out to dry. As well as Anderson shelters, there was something called a street surface shelter.
Right.
It's very hard to see how this would have protected you had a bomb dropped. It was basically a long concrete and brick structure that was built to house the occupants of one whole street. And it was pretty grim inside. It was dark. They had wooden benches, but that was it. And as one man, Ray, said to me, he said, they illustrating the them and us attitudes began to build up in that time. He said, they only wanted us in there so that it would be easier to dig us all out in one go rather than going through the houses individually. So, yes, this anger really took a hold. And I think it reached a boiling point on the third night of the Blitz. Have you heard of the bombing of a school in Canning Town?
Yes.
South Hallsborough. I'll tell the story here. So what happened? What happened?
Yeah. Sorry.
So that's all right. So on the third night of the Blitz, Canning Town, which is because of its proximity to the docks, and the docks, as we know, was amongst the worst bombed areas because of the concentration of industries. They felt that if they crippled the docks, they would cripple manufacturing in England. And so as a result of that, you had the wholesale bombing of factories and warehouses that lined the loop of the Thames. But obviously what came with that was a huge concentration of civilians and people living, EastEnders living in these houses. So Canning Town was particularly badly bombed. And there was a school that had been set up in Canning Town, South Hallsville School, a primary school, that had been closed down as a school and set up as a rescue centre. Now, my understanding of a rescue centre is that if you get bombed out, you go there, you're there for a couple of hours, they give you a change of clothes and a cup of tea, and then you're on your way. But that didn't happen in Canning Town's case because the transport in and out of the docks had been effectively shut down. There was no way of getting people out, and because so many people were getting bombed out, within hours this place was heaving with people. I think there was 600 people that were gathered in this school. Right. It's hard to imagine a sort of worse scene. There were very elderly people who were confused and in pain. You had children crying. You had people coming in the nightgowns that they had been bombed out of, covered in blood with burnt, lacerated feet. And all the authorities could really do was offer them a cup of tea. And they kept saying that we've got coaches coming to take you out to the safety zones. And tension and frustration built. and day turned to night, the next day turned to night. More and more people kept coming in, bringing the smell of cordite and burning with them. And things had really reached a desperate point. So by the third night of the Blitz, the inevitable bomb hit. It went through the reinforced concrete roof. It went down 3 floors and straight into the basement where 600 people were sheltering. Yeah. And it showed them, entombing them in tons of masonry. And this was a really, unimaginably horrific scene. I spoke to a man called Stan, who was there as the rescuers trying to pull these people out. And I think West Ham Council's official death toll was 73, and he said, there is no way that was the case. He said, I saw more bodies being pulled out of the crater, the lip of the crater. They dug for 12 days, and then I think eventually the authorities ordered that the site be quicklime, they sprinkle quicklime in it and it be concreted over because there was no way they were getting any more bodies out. And I think this, very much a dark veil of suffering went over the East End that day. Everybody knew somebody who had died down there. And in reaction to that, what happened was, that and numerous other bombing tragedies that were unfolding. 7 days after the Blitz broke out, there was a group of people from Stepney, 77 people, led by an ARP man, took over the underground banqueting suite of the Savoy. We had ladies and gentlemen in fur coats and eating Dover sole, and in came a motley crew from Stepney. And their demands were quite simple. They said, right, we have every right to take shelter here, as you do. And they were quite canny in their approach because the Savoy Hotel at that point, I think it housed many of the American journalists who were covering the war and therefore weren't bound by the same censorship that the English journalists were. And so they were very effective in getting the message across, and it made, the next day the occupation ended and it made the papers. And sure enough, 7 days after that, Churchill had a U-turn and said, okay, from now on, he said that the use of tube shelters can be used for shelter, not just for transport. And so I think we saw this sort of seed of anarchy and protest that embedded itself within the East End in reaction to the woeful lack of shelter. And I don't think that streak of anarchy and protest has ever really left. I think it grew up in the ashes of the Blitz, very much so. But if I can just conclude, I think it's such a difficult time to sum up the Blitz, but I really like this quote from a historian by the name of Josh Levine. He wrote a brilliant book called The Secret of the Blitz. And he wrote, life was dangerous, it was hard, and lived in the shadow of invasion and death. It was also exciting and shot through with optimism. People pulled together and helped strangers. They broke rules and exploited neighbours. They bonded with and stole from one another. They grew to understand, but to dislike each other. They tolerated without complaint and complained without tolerance. They were scared and fearless. They coped and they cracked. In short, they behaved like a lot of human beings. And I think that seems to me to embody that confusion and chaos of those long months. Right.
Well, and if I may ask you as a corollary to that, did you come across in any of your interviews people's take on the King and Queen and on Winston Churchill? How did they view both of those?
Well, the East End's a very patriotic place.
Right.
The monarchists, a lot of people loved the royal family, and of course they did themselves a great favour, the royals, by, for example, with the Canning Town bombing, the King and Queen were on the scene within, they were there virtually within hours, showing their faces, as did Churchill, so he turned up at all these things. But there was growing dissent. I interviewed one woman and she said every time Churchill came round to the East End giving the V for victory sign, she said, I turned it round the other way. She goes, I didn't need people telling me how to keep my morale up. She goes, she found it patronising almost. But I think there is still a large groundswell of support and love for the monarchy. But definitely Churchill and the government and authority, there was very much this them and us situation that grew up out of the anger of the fact that we are being bombed nightly. And one man, Stan, put it to me this way. He said, Kate, we're cannon fodder. That's all we were. Working class vendors, we were cannon fodder. And that really struck me.
Yeah, that is a tough take on it. You include, obviously, one chapter in the book about the Bethnal Green tube disaster in March 43. I wonder if you could tell us more about the event and the impact that that had on the East End society.
Absolutely. And so the tube disaster, which, as we now know, my namesake Kate Thompson died in, it's very well known in Bethnal Green, but largely known outside of Bethnal Green, which I still find strange because it apparently is the biggest civilian disaster to ever have occurred in wartime.
Mm-hmm.
So 173 people were crushed to death on the steps down to the Underground on the night of March the 3rd, 1943. And what happened was, I think it was about 8:17, and it was a very dark, rainy Wednesday evening. And the air raid sirens went off. Now, this was not cause for concern by this point. The civilians were 4 years into the war by this point. It was a well-practiced routine. You got your bundle, you went down the tube. Now, the tube was, at this point, a working shelter. 7,000 people slept down there at the height of the Blitz, which is an astonishing number. And the only entrance to this subterranean city was 17 very slippery, very dark, narrow steps. Now, I know that Bethnal Green Council had been onto central government seeking funds to improve the staircase. They knew it was an accident waiting to happen, and it had been turned down every time. Now, on this particular night, when the sirens went, there was an unfortunate sort of combination of events insofar as lots of people came out of pictures, cinema halls and pubs all at the same time. 3 buses stopped, disgorging even more passengers. So what you had was a crowd of perhaps hundreds, outside this tiny little stairway. And at that moment in time, people reported hearing a noise like they had never heard before. It was a sound of something like a rocket going off. That they said that the floor beneath their feet vibrated, and there was this ear-piercing sort of noise. Now, again, 4 years into the war, EastEnders were very used to the nuances of aerial bombardment. They could tell a Messerschmitt from a Spitfire. They knew that this was a sound like nothing they'd ever heard. And I think, obviously fearing that Hitler had launched some sort of new weapon campaign against them, the crowd surged forward. Now, at this point, there was a young lady, this is alleged, what allegedly happened, a young lady carrying a baby reached the bottom step, and she tripped and sprawled over at the bottom of the stairs. Now, before she could get up, somebody else tripped over her, somebody else tripped over there, and within moments, what you had was almost like this human domino effect. And it was just catastrophic. You had bodies layered 5, 6 deep, all sort of intertangled limbs, and it was just this writhing mess of sort of men and women and children. And I think it must have been unbridled chaos. And some of the reports I've read from it, sound like something from a horror film. People were jumping on top of the piles of bodies, trying to wrench children out. There were shoes flying, there were screams, the ambulance men turned up. And people were extricating bodies as fast as they could. But really, within the space of 15 minutes, that stairwell became a charnel house. And there are some harrowing scenes and witness reports that I heard from that disaster. So the bodies that were pulled out were taken on anything, really, because there wasn't enough ambulances. They were taken at anything that had wheels. From Boy Scouts were taking bodies up to the hospital on carts, and they took them to the local hospital. When that got full, they took them to the morgues and the churches. And when that got full, they had to just lay these bodies out on the pavement. And I spoke to an incredible lady called Dr. Joan Martin, and her story's pretty phenomenal in its own right, to be a female medic in wartime. And she was on duty at Queen Elizabeth Children's Hospital when the bodies started coming in. And she couldn't understand it. She said these bodies came in and they had no scorch marks, there was no broken bones. All that typified them was that they had this sort of very purple face. She goes, it's the only way I could describe it. And they were soaking wet. And that was we now know that the ambulance men had to flick water onto the bodies of the people they were pulling out in order just to see if they were alive or not. And this trickle of bodies quickly turned to a flood. And she said, she described it as like wading through this ghastly heap of bodies. And she said, we had no choice in the end of just lie these bodies out on the hospital corridor. And so 173 people died, mostly women and children in that time. The authorities were out the next day, they installing a central handrail the very next morning. The steps were washed down. The only way that you would know that so many people had died was by this very small or pile of shoes that had been stacked up by the shelter entrance and a broken pram.
Wow.
And and people were told, you must not talk about this. You must never discuss this. And Churchill put it under the Official Secrets Act. And you can see why he didn't want it getting into the enemy's hands, because had they learned that all those people had died and they hadn't even had to drop a single bomb, of course they would have made propaganda delight out of that.
Mm-hmm.
But I think this feeling of not being able to talk added to this collective sense of grief and guilt that people felt. Rescuer's hair turned white overnight. Dr. Jo Martin told me that she left the hospital the next morning and her superior said, "Do not discuss this with anybody." And she didn't for the next 60 years. She didn't even tell her parents. And she had nightmares every single night for 60 years. So this collective sense of guilt really began to sort of sum up the experience. There was no opportunity to share stories, no acknowledgement of what we would now call post-traumatic stress. People were just largely left to get along with it and get on with it. But actually what has happened, and I think this has been an incredible thing, is a very small group known as Stairway to Heaven, and that consists of survivors and survivors' families, launched this very energetic grassroots campaign to raise money to put up a suitable memorial to the dead. And it took them some substantial years, I think 5 years, to raise the money to put this memorial up. And finally, it was unveiled in, I think, January 2018. And all the survivors attended, I attended, and it was a really remarkable day to see people feeling like finally there is a suitable memorial in place. There is an acknowledgement of what we went through, our suffering on the home front, and we can talk and we can share. And it was wonderful because Dr. Jo Martin was there and she cut the ribbon to open the memorial. And she turned to me after and she said, "I really feel like, I can rest now." And she died 2 weeks later.
Wow. At
the age of 101. I thought, you are holding on for that in many ways. And I feel that hopefully that community can now begin to heal and they can begin to make sense of their suffering. But it was a profound tragedy, and I the details of it are so awful. I have trouble getting my head around it now, really. Right. So I always included that within the book. So that's. So
that kind of leads me to the next question. I mean, in your own words, what you've written about and what you've talked about, what do you think, good and bad, was the lasting impact of World War II as a whole on the East End of London, and particularly, of course, on the women in the East End?
Yeah. Well, I think we've discussed earlier, didn't we, about this seed of anarchy and protest. And I definitely think that came out of the Blitz. And I think people assume that the biggest impact of World War II was this sense of stoicism that people had, this, let's carry on and make do and mend and let's keep going. But actually, that incredible stoicism was already well in place in the East End. That's embedded through people, through generations of overcoming desperate poverty. The East End is a place of waves of immigration have come in, from Huguenots to Jewish people fleeing persecution to Irish escaping the potato famine. So what you have is a large, teeming, shifting place of people who are inherently good at adapting and overcoming poverty. So that stoicism was already there. But like I say, I think because of the woeful lack of shelter, because of we've heard about Canning Town disaster, that protest and that anger embedded itself. And that's, I think, been perhaps the biggest effect of the Blitz. But I also think it really made a profound impression. I think everybody I spoke to had one anecdote that their mind automatically reaches for with the Blitz. So I think it's formed a strong sense of people's identity. There's an enormous sense of pride at how people survived the Blitz. Mm-hmm. So I spoke to one woman called Gladys, who's now in her 90s, and she said, and she helped to take over the Underground when it was deemed not suitable for shelter. Right. And she said, what choice did we have? It was happening night after night. Most of the houses in Bethnal Green were so old, it was only the wallpaper holding them up. Not having a safe place to shelter was soul destroying. No one was trying to break the law. It was simply a case of do or die, self-preservation, really. And I think she's right. I think people took matters into their own hands and took on the authorities. But also, there was an enormous sense of pride at people, overcoming it. And this lovely lady called Dolly, who I interviewed, who was 96, said, looking back, it's us women who were the true heroes. It's us who deserve the medals. 6 years we toiled while the bombs dropped around us, risking our lives, working and raising families while the home front was turned into a war zone. My friend's brother came home on leave during the Blitz. He couldn't believe it. He couldn't wait to get back into the army. So I think what we saw here was a group of people who were soldiers, essentially, on the home front. You know, they saw their civilian life turned into a battlefront, and they reacted accordingly. And I think that's what makes it such an astonishing time in history. And certainly I think Hitler felt that the Blitz would cause such a devastating lack of morale that it would almost bring Britain to heel, that you would be forced to negotiate peace terms. Clearly that did not happen. And I think in part it's down to the strength of a lot of these East End women.
Well, that actually leads as a great segue to the next question. How great a challenge to the women of the East End was the post-war world, with the return of literally thousands of men coming back from service? The nature of the place where they lived, totally destroyed, the infrastructure badly damaged. I mean, how did they deal with this post-war world? And again, you mentioned earlier about the election of the Labour government in 1945. What impact did that have on these women? Did they feel as though they finally been recognised in a sense?
I think that the most simplistic way to answer that is it totally depended what age you were.
Mm-hmm.
So if you were from the younger generation, you were desperate to get away from the past. You rejected the way that your grandparents and great-grandparents had lived. So basically what Hitler didn't destroy of the slums during the bombardment, London County Council and their huge slum clearance programs and their tractors and their digging equipment totally finished off. So
right.
See, what we saw was this huge post-war suburbanisation, and a lot of younger people were desperate to move out of the slums. You know, I spoke to this one woman called Doreen Roundstein, and she said they'd lived in the same street, Newnham Street, in Whitechapel, in part of a subdivided damp terraced house. And they lived on the top floor with her husband and children. Her mother-in-law lived on the ground floor, and her cousins lived on the middle floor.
Mm-hmm.
So when they were offered when the council said, okay, we've listed Newnham Street for demolition, and they gave them the opportunity to move out to the new build suburbs, she leapt at the chance, because what she wanted was hot and cold running water. She wanted indoor plumbing, a garden. She didn't want to freeze her bottom off running down to the end of the yard just to go to the toilet.
Right.
They were ripe for change, and they were robust enough to cope with it. And also, she said to me, you know, those communities were wonderful, she said, but they could also be quite parochial, and they could be stultifying. She said, I bought a pair of shoes once and the whole neighbourhood turned out for a look. So there was very little privacy. So she said moving to Redbridge out in Essex gave her the sort of quiet anonymity that she really wanted, and she was very keen to try and fit in there. They actually anglicised their name from Roundstein to Round in order to fit in. I think it was all about trying to better yourself. It was about rejecting the past and looking forward to a bright new modern future where you had a refrigerator and a car and all the mod cons. So for her generation, fantastic. It was a different story, however, for Doreen's mother-in-law, who was a wonderful woman called Hetty Roundstein. Now, Hetty had lived at Newnham Street all her life. She was, I think, in her late 80s by the time the street was listed for slum clearance, and she was devastated to have to leave her community, the only street she'd ever known. You know, there's a real familiarity and rhythm and routine to her life. Every day she shopped at Hessel Street Market. She went to the same place to chicken shop. She stopped at her brother's down Brick Lane to take him his lunch. Every evening she sat on her straight back chair, shelling peas into her apron lap, calling out to her neighbours. You know, she knew her street and her street knew her. So when the council listed this area for demolition, she was the last person to move out from that street. She couldn't bear it. It was just devastating for her. And she only moved to Bethnal Green, you know, which is only about, you know, less than a mile up the road. But it might as well have been in a foreign country to dear Hetty, because she went from a street where she knew everybody to suddenly being in one of these big high-rises.
Right.
And she might have had a washing machine and fresh liner on the floor, but when she opened her door, she looked out on blank sky and empty, you know, concrete pathways. And days went by where she wouldn't see a single soul, or she wouldn't get a visit. So I think the severing of those ties for Hetty was too much, and it broke her heart. Literally, she died about a month after relocating to Bethnal Green.
Wow.
So I tell that story because to me it vividly illustrates how wonderful an opportunity this was for the younger generation, but for the older generation, the destruction of their communities was often too much for them.
Yeah.
Yeah.
On a somewhat lighter note, it's interesting. You include a number of recipes and remedies that were passed on to you by a number of the women that you interviewed for different things. I mean, I would ask you, what have you tried, and do any of them work?
I've tried them all. Trust me, I've tried them all. In fact, funnily enough, my son has a stinking cold at the moment, and so last night I found myself rubbing Vicks onto his feet because apparently that is the cure-all when you've got a cold. And I'm quite often to be found boiling up bones, so I often get a chicken carcass and I boil it down because according to Beatty and the Jewish women, this is the only way to make proper chicken soup. You've got to boil the carcass down, release all the marrow, and then you add your barley or your beans and your herbs, whatever. And that is, that's Jewish penicillin, isn't it? That's the best thing you can possibly have. So I love that. I quite often suffer with ear infections, and I have found that the chicken soup, along with apple cider vinegar, for whatever reason, really, really works. Apple cider vinegar to these women, there was no self-respecting household that didn't have vinegar because it cleaned windows. You could gargle with it with warm water and honey, get rid of your sore throat. You'd rinse your hair with it. Vinegar was a cure-all. It was absolutely used for everything. So I am turning into a bit of an elderly Jewish housewife, I think. I have employed all these methods. But I love another thing that this woman said to me. She said, we used up every part of the animal bar the squeak. So everything would get used, from livers to hooves to you name it. Every part of an animal was used. And that was really down to the fact that it was the most economical way to do it. If you had a chicken, you could get 3 meals out of it. And so economy is the root to wisdom, I think is the old saying. And I definitely have to emulate that.
Wow. Finally, I know this is obviously a tough question, but if I asked you to kind of sum up the collective nature of the women that you interviewed and the stories they related to you, what would you say? What have you drawn from all the work that you've done?
I think it's such an incredibly hard thing to sum up. And I think, I say I or we, I don't know, I think lack the vocabulary to understand the complexities of working class women's lives and that the reality of the East End sort of political economy have ensured that they're really resistant to lazy cliche. I don't think it's impossible to totally sum up East End women. But if I had to, I think it would be this. I think that they were chief females who were the backbone of their tight-knit matriarchies, and who, in the absence of a welfare state, used this almost unwritten code that included hardship, brute force, kindness, resilience, irreverence, subversiveness, craftiness and solidarity to really keep their families fed and their communities bonded. But I like it in a way that a lady called Doreen explained it. She said they were warriors in wrap over aprons. And I think she's right. I think we'll never see their kind again, quite simply.
All right. Well, Kate, I appreciate you answering all those questions, and let's go on from there. So,
thank you, Alan. And I'd just like to say I appreciate you. I know you got in touch with me after you read my book and very kindly put my name forward for this. So I appreciate your interest as well. It's lovely to talk to somebody that shares my love of the East End.
Well, and again, I think, as I've said before, I mean, even today, even in 2020, any American tourist that goes to the East End of London today would find a completely different East End. Canary Wharf, the Docklands, it's all gone. It's all gone.
God. There is no comparison.
With that, the people that live there, it's not the same anymore.
There are still a few old diehards, though. A lot of the ladies in my book still live in Tower Hamlets.
Right.
And it reminds me very much of that film, Up, I think it is, where these women seeing these houses, glass and huge corporate structures go up around their houses, and yet they have stuck resolutely to their homes. And I know Mari, this very elderly Cockney lady that I interviewed, she said, the only way I'm leaving here is in a wooden box. So you still get, you have the old diehards alongside the new wave of gentrification. It's a fascinating place to visit.
And if I ask you, for an American audience, what is the definition of a Cockney, a true Cockney?
Oh, this
What's it
debate has
supposed
been
to be?
raging.
Isn't it
Well,
supposed to be, you're supposed to be born within the sound of Bow
Well,
bells?
you
Oh,
are supposed to be born within the sound of the Bow Bells, which isn't in Bow at all. It's actually in Cheapside, which is
right.
near the city. But someone said to me, the only way you can say you're a real Cockney is if you can say 40,000 feathers on the thrush of a, on the 40,000 feathers on a bird's thrush neck or something. There's some old saying that I can't possibly say because I'm not a Cockney. But I think a lot of people take great pride in saying, I'm a Cockney, I was born within the sound of the Bow Bells. But in reality, actually, the East End was, the sort of parameters of it are very hotly disputed. Lots of people
Right.
say that it's bordered by Hackney in the north, by the River Thames in the south, and by Stratford in the east, and the city, sorry, Stratford in the west and the city in the east. But it's a wild and shifting place. I think a lot of people can truly lay claim to being a Cockney.
Yeah, that's true. All right, well, thank you very much.
Thank you, Alan.
All right. Amanda, are you there?
Thank you, Kate and Alan. What a fascinating conversation. Again, we'll be taking questions from the Q&A box at the top or bottom of your screen. And thank you to everyone who has already submitted questions. Kate has already answered some of them privately, but we will be asking some of them during this live Q&A session as well. So I'd like to invite Alan and Kate back. Hello.
Hi, hello.
So let's get started. Yes?
Yes, great.
Okay.
Lots of
Awesome.
questions on the chat today.
Yeah, thank you for typing your answers to some of the questions. It's been really great to have you in the Q&A box here. So the first one's kind of serious, but a fascinating question nonetheless. It's about domestic violence. The person said they were surprised, horrified, and slightly amused all at the same time by a tale in the Stephanie Dorsett Society, where one of the women was clearly not averse to turning to violence. What does your research suggest about the prevalence of violence amongst those communities, both in terms of women as victims of domestic violence, but also as perpetrators of violence against other women and children?
Okay, that's a great question. Thank you for asking that, because definitely violence is very much a part of the everyday narrative of the East End. You know, East End women often refer to men as having what they call heavy hands, but it's equally true to say that women could really dish it out, and it wasn't uncommon to see East End women fighting on the streets. And I think the reason for that is because responsibility for control of the family and that sort of maintenance of that really hard-won respectability often rested with the matriarch. It was about power and control and an unwillingness to get outside forces involved, so for example the police. And I think that the reality is these women were tough and they were resilient, and so often their stories are told via this slightly kind of one-dimensional stereotype or an overripe sentimentality that doesn't really, for me, kind of capture the nuance or complexity of it. Because I can't tell you how many times I've heard mainly women but also men say to me, oh, my earliest memory of my mum was seeing her fighting in the street, and sometimes with a slight sort of note of pride almost there. And I would just like to perhaps just share this story recounted to me by a 92-year-old man called Ronnie. And he told me this. He said, my mum Flo was only 4'8", but I saw her punch a man down 3 flights of stairs for slapping me when I was a kid. He recalled. She had a sister, Rhoda, in the tube disaster, which we know about now. She lost another sister, Maud, who was decapitated by a lorry in the blackout. And her son, Teddy, died of TB in 1946. She was so grief-stricken, she lost all of her hair, but she never gave up the fight. The war brought out the strength in women. And that was very much echoed by another lady, Mitzi, who I interviewed, who told me an astonishing story about how she was walking down Watley Street Market and she saw 2 women having a fight, and she recognised the sort of lead chief female, the matriarch, and she took out from her hair what was a Kirby grip. Do you know what I mean by a Kirby grip? It's like a hair slide that women used to wear, a small metal hair slide. Anyway, she took it out from her hair and she unravelled it and she wrapped it around her knuckles like a DIY knuckle duster, and used this as a weapon to basically to overpower this other woman. So yeah, I mean, we can see that women were tough, they weren't averse to violence. But I do also just sort of want to make the point, if I can here, that that although women were the perpetrators of violence, they were very much the victims of violence as well, particularly domestic violence, coercive control, and abuse. But obviously, that was not a word that was sort of in the vernacular, if you like, back then. Domestic violence was really more commonly known as flying plate night in the East End, which basically meant that when a man got a pay packet on a Friday night and he came home via the pub, you could expect the female members of the household to get it, basically. And Mitzi, the same lady who told me the knuckle duster story, told me that her earliest memory was of hiding under the kitchen table, and she had a slipper in her hand that she was using to whack her father's ankles to stop him swinging her mum around the kitchen by her hair. So horrific degradation and abuse that was heaped upon women back then. Just as a final story about domestic violence, another lady, Vera, told me that her mum, she was a mum of 7, and she said my dad was absolutely useless. He spent all the housekeeping on beer and beds. So my mum was forced to hold down 3 jobs to feed 7 children. Her wages had to spread to many mouths. And she's regularly suffered abuse, beatings, humiliation. And she often said to her mum, why don't you leave him? Leave him. And the mum would say, and where would I go? And she was absolutely right. Where was a single mum of 7 children supposed to go? Because there were no domestic violence refuges or women's aid of any sort. So women were very much locked into a cycle of poverty and despair that it was impossible to escape from. And so that's why I included violence, women as perpetrators and victims of domestic violence, because it was the reality of the time and it was the currency of the streets, if you like. So I hope that answers your question.
Thank you. Similarly, actually, this question asks, the women that you speak of sound so courageous, driven, and fierce. Do you think that we do badly in comparison to them? Life feels very easy compared to what they had to cope with, which is saying a lot in 2020. Can you think of any modern public figure who represents?
Oh God, do you know, I answered that question in the chat box. I'm going to really have to think about a modern equivalent. I think that's such a difficult question because we're coming from such different places. You know, we live in a society where we're protected by the welfare state. You know, we have never had to really worry about where our next meal is coming from. And I think for many of these women who lived in that state of poverty and had to hold down 3 jobs, they had no choice but to react the way that they did. We have many more choices today. So to find a comparison, I'd be really interested to hear what other people had to say about that. Because I guess you'd have to find somebody who was born back then, who is now in their 90s today, to find a direct comparison. But that's a great question.
Alan, did you have any thoughts on that?
Not really, because I think Kate's right. I mean, I think it obviously is a totally different world. But then again, I think for an American audience, you know, we can look at cities like New York or Baltimore or some of the big industrial cities, Pittsburgh, and I'm sure in some ways we can find a similar template of the role of women and what they play in those industrial city societies. And I'm sure some of these stories ring true to people that are from those parts of the world as well, leaving aside the war issue.
That's a great point.
I agree. I think it's very difficult to say, you know, to draw that comparison and say we fall short, because we are dealing with an entirely different set of circumstances, and our lives are so completely different. I suppose the only way we can compare is with the current pandemic and how we're coping and reacting to that.
Thank you. So here's a more specific question. Were there many stations like Bethnal Green? And I think you answered this in the conversation, where did upper class people take shelter? Was the Bethnal Green tube shelter unique, or were there others like it?
It was unique insofar as it wasn't I think it was the only station on the London Underground map that actually wasn't a working station, because at the outbreak of war, they'd been building on connecting it to the Central Line, to Liverpool Street Station. So when war broke out, all building work was disbanded. And so they were able to take it over in the way that I described in the presentation, that they had the library and the doctor's quarters, and it was a fully functioning subterranean town, really. But other tube stations like Tottenham Court Road and Piccadilly Circus and the more, all the other tube stations on the tube map were working stations, but they were also working train stations in the day. So the train stopped running at a certain time of night and everybody was forced to sleep on the platform. So Bethnal Green was definitely unique in that sense, which is why I loved uncovering that story. You know, like, wow, who could think that there'd be a library and theatres and so much life underground? But it would have been a very different story had you travelled a few stops up on the Central Line. Then you would have found people sleeping wherever they could get a spot, basically.
And such incredible images you included.
I know, I love them. I really love that. I'm actually setting my next novel it's called the Little Wartime Library, in the underground library at Bethnal Green, because I find it so intriguing that people were living underground and accessing this little hidden gem of a library.
Well, we will look forward to hearing about that.
I'm just going to write it now.
Okay, another question for you about a little bit more specific. Do you know if the children in the East End were evacuated like the kids in other parts of London?
Oh yeah, definitely. I think, Alan, you might have the statistic on this, but I think it was around 1.2 million children were evacuated at the outbreak of war in what was known as Operation Pied Piper. And the idea was from the authorities to get children out of the danger zones and have them billeted in places in the countryside. I believe, and Alan will correct me if I'm wrong, that the decision was voluntary. It rested with the parent as to whether or not you sent your child away. And so many people that I interviewed were evacuated. Some came back because of what they called the phony war. So the first 6 months, nothing really happened. And so a lot of these children came back, and a lot of children were evacuated again when the Blitz broke out. But the most interesting thing to me about the evacuation scheme was the massive diversity of stories that emerged out of it, of experience. So some people had a wonderful time. They became lifelong friends with the people they were billeted with. They saw the countryside and green fields and cows for the first time, and it really remains in the memory as one of the happiest times of their lives. But other women, it was a very different story. If the person that you were billeted with was cruel or abusive, then a lot of women suffered some terrible abuse. I interviewed a 90-year-old woman in Poplar, and halfway through the interview she broke down in tears, and she told me that she suffered a serious sexual assault as a 9-year-old girl when she had been evacuated. And this struck me as heartbreaking. She'd never really told anyone, and I said to her, do you still think about it? And she said, every day. And that was an unresolved abuse. It seems inconceivable now that we would take so many children and send them off to live with complete strangers in the countryside, where they were often picked out in church halls by people. It's such an extraordinary part of history. But yeah, in answer to the question, yes, lots of people from the East End were evacuated. Anything you'd like to add to that, Alan?
Well, and I think for a lot of those kids, I mean, it's interesting because I think American audiences have seen a lot of this stuff often portrayed in series like Foyle's War. There was one story about a kid that was evacuated and the problems that he had. And for a lot of these children to be taken away from the society that Kate has described, which is integral to every part of their life, particularly from an urban environment to a rural environment. I mean, a lot of these kids, they'd never seen green grass before. They'd never seen a cow. They'd never seen a farm. And then to be put into this environment and expected to adjust. Again, I think it's hard for any of us to really appreciate to be taken out of our environment and dumped into a completely alien environment. And often not with people who were loving towards these kids. A lot of people were, and as Kate said, a lot of people really did have a good time, but a lot of kids struggled, and a lot of kids came back home because, as Kate described, the phony war, which lasted until May 1940, a lot of these kids having come back home, a lot of the kids then ended up becoming victims as well. Kate described the school in Canning Town, but it was hard for the government to keep these kids away, and they wanted to come back home, and they did come back home, and it just compounded the situation.
Just a quick question in reference to your previous answer about Bethnal Green. I know there's a memorial there, but has it been preserved as a museum, or is it still a working station?
Oh, it's still a working station. Yeah. Oh, very much so. It's an incredibly busy tube station. When I go out and do my research in the East End, I always go to Bethnal Green, and I still find it staggering when I get off the platform on the westbound and I walk up the station. I think, oh, that's where the library was, or that's where the theatre was. And, I want to tell everybody who's around me, do you know where you're standing? Look, that used to be a theatre there. Of course, everybody's just standing there on their phones now, masked up. But yeah, no, it's definitely one of the busiest East London tube stations. And of course, when you come out of the tube now, you come up that same set of stairs. Obviously, it's been expanded, but one of the stairwells that you can walk out of is the same stairwell where 173 people died. And you come out, and of course, now you see this beautiful memorial, memorializing the lives of those people that died, this huge teak structure. And people are learning now much more about that tragedy because of this memorial, and the significance is now given back to the East End. So if you go to the East End, I would urge you to visit Bethnal Green.
If travel is ever on the list,
yeah,
again,
right.
we'll put it on the list. Okay, question. And we'll take just a couple more here because I'm just watching our time. Could you please say a few words about the government's attempts, if any, to address the grinding poverty? Was it a political issue on their radar?
My belief towards that, and Alan will correct me if I'm wrong, but my belief towards that is that obviously there wasn't a welfare state in place. So no, I think poverty was very much under the radar, particularly in the East End. And that is probably why I think that you had this, it was a very political place, the East End. It was the only place where you had socialism, communism, trade unionism, fascism residing side by side. And that is why the communists were able to get such a stronghold in the East End of the 1930s and 40s, because they were aware of the plight of working people. My understanding is that what happened during the Blitz and the chaos and the devastation, and it brought to light, one of the good effects of the Blitz is it brought to light the suffering and the poverty and the evils of society. And that was where the Beveridge Report came out of. I think it was the Beveridge Report that led to the foundation of the welfare state. And so post-war, when the Labour Party came in with such a massive landslide, all these incredible reforms were brought about to build a safety net into society so that people would never again have to experience the poverty that we saw Kate Thompson and her neighbours experience in Queen Square. Would you agree with that, Alan? I mean, I feel like the Blitz is a turning point.
Yeah, I think it was. And I think, the election of the Attlee government in the summer of 45 really did change everything. And in fact, that is a subject that's interesting in itself. One that I often get asked, how did the British public turn around and vote out of office the man that had just led them through the war? And again, I think for a lot of people, it's to understand that a lot of the men coming back from World War II had the experience of their fathers and grandfathers coming back from World War I and saying, okay, this is a new world now. Between the 1920s and 1930s, it was clear it was not a new world. I think in 45 onwards, that's where you had this onrush of, legislation from the Attlee government to begin changing things. So the nationalisation of the railroads, nationalisation of the electricity boards, the start of the slum clearances in the East End, and the creation of things like new towns, all ringed around London, where a lot of East Enders were then invited to go out to live in some of these new towns like Redbridge that Kate's talked about. But of course, the Attlee government is defeated in 1951 and Churchill comes back in. So there's this kind of stop-start mentality of changing society. And again, I think you see some of this in Save the Midwife, or Call the Midwife, where you start seeing the East End changing and the issue of legislation and new buildings going up, and what does it mean, for the people that live in that East London society. So one of the other big things that I think, and again, Kate touched on this, is the use of tower blocks, where you have people taken from streets and put into these, 25 and 30-story tower blocks, where it literally is anonymous. As Kate described earlier, you open the front door and all you have is a corridor and an elevator. There's not that same street life mentality. That was a huge wrench for a lot of these people that lived in the East End. But for the government, it was a way of moving out, clearing out the slums and trying to start again. So it was a difficult time for so many people.
Thank you. So we'll take one more question here. They asked specifically, was there anything you had to cut, I think from your book or your research, but you wish you could have included?
Oh God, so much. I think I got a bit carried away. I interviewed so many women and I put everybody's stories in. And I think when it came back for the first edit, it was running something like 20 or 30,000 words over. So I had to literally go through and cut swathes, and that was very painful for me. I really did want to include the story of a lady I met called Eva Slush, who was a very interesting story about the Holocaust, and who her and her mother ended up in Auschwitz. And she managed to, when the camp was liberated, she returned and she moved to London. And she saw firsthand a lot of the kindness of these sort of chief female women that I refer to, the go-to matriarchal women. And she had a lot of praise for them in terms of how they rehabilitated in her and helped her. And unfortunately, I did have to cut that story, but it was fascinating to me. Although Eva has written her own books, which is wonderful, and you can read her story. But it's, you know, I had to really hold to scrutiny every story that I put in that book and see whether it was, you know, did it hold its own? What did it add? What did it contribute? But there were just stories and stories and stories that I had to, unfortunately, let go. But, you know, they all helped to form the overall mentality of the book. And I do share them via social media, which has been a wonderful way to get feedback on them.
Well, we are all lucky that you are the keeper of all of these stories and memories. So well.
I feel like that. I feel like the story gatherer. That's how I feel.
Thank you so much, Kate and Alan. Thank you for joining us for our Smithsonian Streaming Program.
It's been an honor to appear here. So thank you very much for inviting me on. And if anybody has any questions they'd like to ask, please do email me or get in touch. I'll be happy to answer them.
I think we're putting Kate's email address in the chat. So you can click that link and then save the email for later if you want it. Thank you so much to all of our viewers for watching, for your great questions. We are a little over time, but we still have over 100 people here. So thank you everyone for listening. And as a reminder, Kate's book is available for purchase from local bookseller Politics and Prose. We've included a link in the chat for your convenience as well. If you enjoyed today's program, definitely check out our upcoming programs that will be listed on your screen shortly, as well as the many other exciting programs that we have on our website. Thank you so much to everyone. Have a great day.
Thank you, everybody. Goodbye.